Thank you, everyone. Thank you for coming out today. I'm so happy to be able to present my research to you. I want to thank a bunch of people. I want to thank Dr. Gillespie and Dr. Kaliaset Amen and Anita Spencer-Stevens and Dr. Michelle Gordon and Dr. Carl Sedler and Dr. Bird at the JWJI. My time here has been incredibly rewarding, as you'll see in just a moment. It's helped me immensely in the progress of my book. I also want to thank the folks in the Marble Library and the Woodruff Library, particularly Pelham McDaniel, who isn't here, but Randall Burkett is here. Both of them have aided tremendously in my research. And I also want to thank Carol Anderson and Brett Gadsden and the African American Studies Department for their intellectual support. So let's start the show. So what I'm going to present today is the opening chapter of a book project on Louisiana and photography and the long civil rights movement in the 1890s. And the book is called Picturing Black Freedom in Louisiana, from Homer Plessy to Hurricane Katrina. And I'm interested in Louisiana for a few reasons. Number one, New Orleans, if you don't know it, New Orleans is the site of the Plessy versus Ferguson decision, which was a watermark in the long civil rights movement. Secondly, Louisiana has, and in the 1890s, had a vibrant middle class that had money enough and resources enough to buy and make their own portraits. And three, most of the photos that we see of the civil rights movement were taken primarily in two states and in one time. They were taken primarily in Alabama and Mississippi, and they were taken in the 1950s and 1960s. But I know, as many people can attest, that there is a rich history of photography in Louisiana and the civil rights movement. So what I'm adding to this discussion is the assertion that this idea of the long civil rights movement, the movement that starts not in the 1950s but starts in the 1890s, that the long civil rights movement begins in Louisiana and is based in Louisiana. And it's in Louisiana that we see some of the earliest uses of African Americans using photography as a political tool and a social practice. So I want to turn to this particular documentary right here that was on, I think, last year, maybe 2014. Yeah, and it's going to go here because it helps to frame what we're talking about. Here's a screenshot of it. The documentary is called Through a Lens Darkly. And we're just going to watch a little bit because it's going to help us frame our discussion today. That's a really good frame. I'm going to stand it and keep the image here because, as Carrie Mae Weems says right here, I'd never seen black people look like that before. And looking at these images of whites in blackface, I knew exactly what she meant. What these images help us do is give us a frame, and it helps us explore the historical content. So let's go back. Let's go to the historical content right here. Oh yeah, here we are. So these are images. As I tell my classes, it was very common in the 1880s and 1890s and 1900s to depict all people of color as being somewhat African-looking or Negroid-looking. So these two magazines, Puck right here and Judge magazine, they were opposed to the war, the Spanish-American War. And what they're saying right here, for example, is that here's a Filipino child. Now to us it looks like an African-American child, but here's a Filipino child, and if you can see here, what William McKinley, this is President McKinley, what he's trying to do is baptize this child in the waters of civilization, right there. And this, I know. In this image right here, again, Uncle Sam, a paternal white figure, is trying to teach unruly children of color. Like, this is Cuba, this is Philippines, this is Hawaii, and this is Puerto Rico. We have a Native American child reading the book upside down. We have a Chinese American child outside of the classroom, and a black child who is a servant. Now, the cartoon itself is a satire, but the images remain the same. The images of sort of black people or people of color as children, that remains the same. So, although these explicitly racist cartoons belittle people of color and African Americans specifically, and confine African Americans to a place of social inferiority, I say that these images are pointed representations of white rage at African American social and economic freedom. And I'm leaning heavily on this notion of white rage because of Emory's own Carol Anderson. And as we know, even now, white rage explains a lot of things. So another way to say this is that when you look at these gross caricatures of African Americans or of people of color, just keep in mind that these aren't just racist images, but that the illustrators are furious at black advancement. And not for nothing, some things don't change. But we're also going to be looking at some postcards. And that's sort of the second part of our lecture today. And I came across these postcards in the Marble Library. And the postcards show a different setting, a much more harmonious setting. And they represent a nostalgia for the golden age of the South, filled with memories, kind and gentle memories of gentle masters and happy slaves. But that's also not an accurate way of depicting African Americans, as you'll see. In the last part of the lecture, we'll look at images of African Americans that they produced themselves in the same time period. I think it's important to say again that these images emerge in the same 20 or 30-year time period. All of them, the cartoons, the postcards, the photographs. And it's in the 1890s and 1900s when African Americans produced their own photographs. They're going to have a different narrative, a narrative of citizenship and yes, respectability. They are going to reject rage and nostalgia in favor of humanity and dignity. So furthermore, and that this is my hook of the book, I think that these images of the 1890s and 1900s forecast the civil rights movement and its photography of the 1950s and 60s because they establish a paradigm of highlighting humanity and civil disobedience. And that paradigm, again, begins in the 1890s, or even earlier, but in the 1890s for our photographs. So let's go forward. So yeah, I got to throw in a little bit of history here because I'm a historian, and I can't exist without the history. The images appear. These images, these Puck and Judge, they came into being. These two magazines came into being in the 1890s, and they were meant to be a humorous comment on American politics. Images that we're going to see now, the illustrations don't just appear in the Puck and Judge. They appear in The Atlantic. They appear in Life magazine, Harper's Weekly. But what made these two magazines particularly popular was their timing. They emerged at the intersection of three particular eras in American history: the end of Reconstruction, the Gilded Age, and the Progressive Era. The end of Reconstruction is that period after Reconstruction, 1880s to 1900, 1920, when the former Confederate states, they now had free reign over African Americans. I mean, you had the Civil War that ended slavery, and then you had the Reconstruction period in which African Americans were granted a modicum of political power. And then there's that period afterwards where the Jim Crow laws come in. And these Jim Crow laws are being instituted largely in the former Confederate states, but throughout the South. So then we have the Gilded Age. And the Gilded Age is this time when there's a great manufacturing boom. The United States becomes the world's biggest manufacturer of stuff in the 1890s. There are big changes in immigration, many bringing people from all across the world to the United States. And the United States is really beginning to change its economy. But, as we know, the wealth is concentrated in the hands of a few. And it's making people kind of scratchy, as I say. It's making people very, very angry at the economic changes. And finally, we have the beginning of the progressive era, where it's an era of reform, it's an era of openness. We see in the progressive era the founding of the NAACP and lots of other racial organizations, and they're trying to address this issue of black inequality, particularly black poverty. As one historian said, Rayford Logan, he called this intersection of these three areas the nadir of the Negro, the time when African Americans had the least amount of wealth, the least amount of political power, and the least amount of social capital. It's interesting that at a time when America is becoming a very wealthy country, African Americans are still flat broke. So these cartoons emerged during this time period, and they're in the nadir of the Negro. And as we see, we have many of the common ugly stereotypes. There are, as we see here, we have the wide lips, the big eyes, same tortured English right here. I know that you can read. I'm not going to read to you. But the gist of this image is that this black woman has huge feet that are so huge, she needs 2 sets of ice skates, not just one, in order to enjoy her date with her man over there. These initial set of images are from the New York Public Library digital collection. So here's another one. I was looking at this collection, and this is from 1875, as you can see. And it's important to know that there was a Civil Rights Act that was passed in 1875. And what this image is saying is that if blacks, the reason why blacks got it passed is that they somehow paid for a kickback. They bribed people bribed the Congress into passing it. In this case, it's around the same time. You can see this again, a stereotypical African American. In this case, he's really his clothes are threadbare, and this poor white child, he's like, what am I gonna do? What am I gonna do here? And this is one of the color images you can see that really caught my attention. What this image is saying is that these black men are playing baseball and enjoying themselves, but one black player has to change his body or change his stance at the home plate in order to be able to participate in the game. So I want to say that images like these are not limited to magazines. Dr. McDaniel, Paula McDaniel, he was telling me just recently that there's a famous house of printmaking, Currier and Ives, that had a series of lithographs called the Darktown Comic Series. And so I laugh because people are angry. But I laugh. This is a picture of just general chaos with African Americans jumping from a burning building, and I think it's meant to be humorous. Clearly, African Americans don't know how to ride horses because the woman's about to be thrown off one. And in this case, the corruption is pretty wide in the sense that we have 2 African Americans fighting over ownership of this cow, but we have a third one who's so corrupt he's stealing the milk. So these images are fairly common. And after looking at them for an extended period, when you look at this stuff over and over again, you begin to notice some things. Excuse me. So this is the one. This is what I began to notice when I realized a particular characteristic stands out, when I began to notice that. And that is their oversized feet. There. Right there. Right there. Oh, poor guy. You can't but see the gigantic feet on this man. Of course, right there. family right here, and so when you combine this image with all the other ones, with all the others, with all of the other racial stereotypes, we get a particular idea of what's coming on. I would not have thought about the feet had they not actually said it. You know, my feet have to be 12 inches from the home plate, and I can't reach the home plate if I stand up. So he's got enormous feet. Like in this family right here, this woman right here, again, she had to buy 2 sets of skates in order to fit her feet. I think the big feet, after a while, after thinking about this stuff, I think the big feet symbolize this feeling that African Americans are taking up too much space, that they're taking up too many resources. And because this image of big feet is also applied to whites, but it's a particular white person, Theodore Roosevelt, the images show African Americans with an exaggerated sense of their own importance. But more than that, because I don't want these images to be about blacks. I mean, you can stop right there. But I think if we dig a bit deeper, these images are about white rage and the perception of the loss of political power. It's as if blacks are entering a space and they don't deserve to be in this space, and they're taking up resources. They're taking, the images make sense if we start talking about space. Not just physical space, but political space and social space. They demonstrate a discomfort with African Americans in public spaces. They're saying that blacks are too big for their britches. And that blacks, in the case of perhaps these people right here, blacks lack a sense of propriety, that they can't, African Americans can't cope with the world. They don't fit in, and they never will. When I thought about it this way, what we see here is a picture of white rage, a fury that African Americans are no longer slaves. And this is where I pivot, and this is where I thank Carol Anderson, because as we know, she wrote in the Washington Post in 2014 that the Ferguson riots were not pictures of black rage, they were pictures of white rage. And you can even read or think about the 1896 Plessy Decision in that same way. The idea of the Plessy Decision is that you have to have so-called separate but equal spaces. But really, when you look at it, what they're saying is that there is this inviolate white place. There's this place set aside for white people that blacks cannot enter. We got to keep that place sacred. We got to guard that space with our lives, with violence. We got to do whatever we have to do to make sure that blacks can't enter that space. I realized I was onto something when I began to think about a film that I use in class a lot, and that is The Birth of a Nation. Because in this particular rendition, again, the image, we're not talking so much about how blacks are inferior. This is an image, or this is a depiction of Thomas Dixon, who is furious that blacks are now in this political era. So we can watch a little bit of it. Here we are. So for those of you who don't know, or the movie, or what the scene is, this is the scene that's set during Reconstruction, and African Americans are now holding political offices of great power after 200 years of being enslaved. And Thomas Dixon, in his play, The Klansman, is intent on showing just how much African Americans have screwed the political system up, and how they are invading white space. So we can see here, we see Thomas Dixon's and D.W. Griffith's rage at black political power. And in this case, blacks are not just invading political space, they are taking white women too. That white women are public property, and that blacks are stealing white women. So the popularity of The Birth of a Nation and the political cartoons indicated that just how furious, how deep the anger went at African American survival and progress since slavery. That African Americans are inhabiting now the halls of power and making off with white women. This cannot be countenanced. This cannot. But let's pivot a little bit. Excuse me. Let's pivot a little bit. And I'm going to pivot by, right here. No, exit full screen. Here we are. So we're going to pivot a little bit by looking at a different rendition of African Americans. In this case, what I found in the Marlborough Library are images of African Americans in the cotton fields. This is where the Marlborough Library really helped me. I was looking for images of African Americans in Louisiana, but it was the Robert Langmuir collection that really opened my eyes to this new area of inquiry. This is another form of misrepresentation. It's also quite stereotypical, but the setting is the plantation. And these images that we'll see, instead of African Americans taking up too much space, in these images, blacks are not taking up any space at all. In fact, they are part of the landscape. They are part of the environment. It's much less explicitly racist, and yet they're saying something quite specific. These images were pretty popular, were very popular, and what you can see, I believe, is that they are a celebration of the mid-19th century and the golden age of the South, the golden age of slavery. These postcards, as we'll see, reject the Civil War and Reconstruction. And this, again, these are made not during the Civil War or during the 1940s. They're made in 1900. And it's less than a generation, or maybe a generation a little bit after the Civil War, and at a time when Reconstruction is still a fresh memory. And these renderings show African Americans as if they are in their natural habitat. Right here. What's interesting about these images is that cotton is a character in the image right here. Cotton is as much a subject or a character in this image as the African Americans. They have to compete. African Americans have to compete for space with the cotton. In most of these cards, African Americans are either not smiling or not facing the camera. And you can really see a difference between black subjects and white subjects. These are a picture of happiness. Let's bale some cotton, with their hats and so forth. And it's a striking difference. What also really signifies white nostalgia for a bygone era were the captions that I came across. And the captions are pretty common as well. Or again, they're sharing the space with the cotton. Cotton is a subject, but as according to this is the happiest place on earth. And I thought, well, happy for who? Who are the happy people here? Goodness gracious. It underscores, like I said, the intensity of the nostalgia. And what also stands out, this is what really struck me, was that the images these postcards often there are lots and lots of postcards that use children. And the children, it's if again, the cotton is framing them. The children seem to be born in cotton, and that's the most that they can aspire to. Here's that one, here's this one, and there's a little baby. These images are incredibly popular, although this one goes is evidently originated in Yazoo City. It goes all the way to Austria. And so what we see here is the two sides of the same coin. If the cartoons are saying that African Americans are conceited and have an exaggerated sense of their own importance, the postcards show African Americans as nearly invisible and part of the scenery. And what they're both saying is that blacks are unfit for freedom. They're either grabbing too much white space or they are happiest when they are in service to whites. So both of these images are carefully constructed fictions. And before I move on, I just want to say this about these images, particularly the ones that's supposed to be in Louisiana. There are some people here from New Orleans, and they will attest that New Orleans doesn't have any cotton fields. What does New Orleans have? Sugar cane. But we don't associate African American labor with sugar cane. We associate it with cotton. But I think that just kind of adds to my point, or my sense that this extreme discomfort with African American freedom means that you can take images of African Americans with cotton and just use it all over. Some of these images are not, they say Louisiana, but I saw some of these that were actually in Kentucky, like the same image, but it said, "Welcome to Kentucky." Or I saw this and it said, "Welcome to Maryland," or "Welcome to New Jersey." This is why it's almost as if the Civil War and Reconstruction never happened. So, all right, so anybody who's taken a class with me, I see many of my students, I always start with the salt, but I'm gonna end with the sugar, because I love the sugar. So let's look at some other images. At the same time, here we are. This is the next set of photos show a different perspective of African Americans. And again, what's striking is that they were produced at the same time as the cartoons and the postcards. They bear witness to the citizenship of African Americans. They are documents of African Americans' humanity. When blacks took photographs of other blacks, the photographs emphasize their place in the United States. Blacks have a space at the ballot box. You can see them at the college concert. You can see them at the grocery store. You can see them as law students. But these images are found in particular places. I found this in the Library of Congress. These are all from the Library of Congress. Why don't we see them? Largely because the images are confined to black newspapers and black magazines at the time. As Professor Lee Rayford has said, and she was a speaker here, she said that by the end of the 19th century, studio portraits became affordable to nearly all classes of African Americans, and enough black photographers located themselves in major towns and cities throughout the country to meet the demand. In other words, black people had enough money to buy pictures, and they did. They were quite insistent that they craft the image, that they set the scenery, that they find the right way to pose, that they get their best angle, and they're doing this for a specific reason. These images, like I said, are in black newspapers and black magazines. And it's important to know that almost every American city that had a population of African Americans more than 5,000, every American city had a black newspaper, and many cities had 2 or 3 black newspapers. African American business owners hired portrait studios to advertise, so they would take pictures and then put them in the newspapers for advertisements. So the point is that there's no shortage of opportunities. There's no lack of audience. And so these images, as I began to look at them, it's almost as if they are in dialogue with the racist caricatures. You have a woman, African-American woman, who's dressed very specifically, and she's dressed very gracefully and talented, and yet we have this caricature that we've seen earlier. It shows an African-American woman trying to fit in, but her gigantic feet and her big lips perhaps give her away. But still, the images try to show things like African Americans hard at work. They are striving. They have civic engagement. They have political empowerment. They are trying to show, these images are trying to show that African Americans were almost better Americans than their white detractors. The white detractors that produced these awful images. They're almost super American. Now it's important, of course, to note that many of these images have a very strong class angle. The class plays as much a role in these images as race does. And that's because many of these photos are of middle-class blacks at the time. And there's a sense that perhaps middle-class blacks are more deserving and perhaps make a more legitimate claim to citizenship than working-class blacks do. But that said, that has much to do with the audience. The intent of the images is to share pictures of hard work. The intent is often to be promotional material. They can be a family album, or in the case of Wilson Chin, this is a picture of survival, how he made it through slavery. You can see here, it took me a long time to actually notice this because I just saw the man. And then I saw these images, this thing around his neck, these chains around his ankles, and these instruments of torture. But that's the gist of it, is that he got through it. He got through it. So what we see in the 1890s, and here are some more from, before I move on, here are some more from this terrific book that I've checked out at the library, about African Americans in New Orleans at the beginning of the 19th century. And again, they are pictures of sort of middle-class comfort. This woman right here, this is the aunt of the woman who wrote the book at a communion in 1906. And here's Andrew Young, his little baby. Here he is, little baby. Yeah, I had to throw that in because African Americans are very across the country, but in this case we have it. We have African Americans being very, very concerned about how their children are depicted. So and it's also at a black studio on Claiborne Avenue. But okay, all right. So what we see in the 1890s and 1900s is African Americans laying the foundation for using photographs as political tools. It's what the New York Times called the New York Times called these photographs of African Americans radically prosaic, as if they are fundamental and undeniable aspects of the American narrative. But this is how I see these photographs working. On the positive side, they reject the caricatures, they reject the rage, they reject the nostalgia, and they affirm African American citizenship. And they undergird the notion of civil rights as a social practice. On the critical side, the photographs also frame the civil rights discussion as a middle class one, and try to document middle class people trying to gain access to opportunity, access to the free market, access to voting rights. But so that's how they connect to the 1950s. That we have to remember that the civil rights movement of the 1950s and 60s, they focused on access to things, and it's not until the late 1960s that the movement focuses on economic injustice and the end and income equality, as we would say. Still, I like to think, as I wrap up, I like to think that these pictures are more like what Dr. Doris Derby has said. She is a civil rights photographer, and she's a retired professor at Georgia State. She said, "I was always interested in the depiction of African American people in a positive light, in a full light. This has been one of the things that I've done all my life." And I think that her photographs are on exhibition, I think now in Tuscaloosa. So this is how I see these photographs working as a vital political tool. moving African Americans away from the rage, away from the nostalgia, away from something like the celebration of the Confederate flag, to a celebration of survival and resilience and transformation. This is the type of transformation that I see going on. So you have this one, and we have that one. This is from Bogalusa, as you can see, a civil rights march there. I feel like there's a linkage, a connection across the eras. Here is, we've seen this. And then Bob Edelman, I think died, about a week ago. But he also documented African Americans in Louisiana. This is during I think a core protest, a voting rights registration protest. We have the three Graces, but we also have these children right here. Though we have images of middle-class respectability, we also have images of inspiration and unity. And it's this story of survival that produces this tremendous movement. That I think the African American narrative begins with this and continues with this, and perhaps reaches into the 21st century. This is in many ways the America that I'm a citizen of. I'm a citizen of the narrative of transformation and survival, not the other crazy narrative of rage and nostalgia. So, is that it? Yeah, that's it. That's my research. Thanks very much.